First of all, I want to thank Tom for his generous introduction. I also want to just take a quick moment to remember someone who, whether you know it or not, is near and dear to all of us here in Allen. You may notice that I serve as the Eugene McDermott Master Teacher of Science at St. Mark's, which was a chair that was set up many, many years ago in 1986 at our school by the McDermotts. And as I stand here at the Allen Library, this is an institution that would not exist in its present form without the kindness and the generosity, particularly of Margaret McDermott over the years. And as many of you know, she recently passed away, but she is near and dear to me. I had the great honor of meeting her on a number of occasions, and I know just how much she cared about this library, about the city of Allen, and also about science education. So I'd like to dedicate tonight's talk to her honor and for all that she has done for so many of us here in the greater Dallas community. So thank you, Ms. McDermott. Now, Tom gives me a great deal of credit for what you're going to hear tonight. To be honest, I played a very, very small role in it. My big role has been in sharing it with the world because, and this is going to sound odd to a lot of you, because I'm allowed to. In the world of human origins research, discoveries like the one you're about to hear were historically kept very quiet, and a very small number of the old boys were the ones that controlled access to the information. And the idea that a middle school teacher from Texas might be one of the people who goes out and helps share this with the world would be unheard of. So I want to tell you a little bit about my story and how it interweaves with the discovery of Homo naledi, which I have to say the last 6 years have been, for me, have been a whirlwind of true excitement. So let's go back to my childhood, shall we? When I was a little kid, and by a little kid I mean before I could read, I fell in love with the book on the left, the Time Life Nature Library. A number of you, if you're of a certain age, remember that. And it was the Early Man book, a copy of which is in the display out in the lobby. And that was my security blanket, if you will, like Linus. I would carry that around with me, and I basically could look at the pictures. Paranthropus boisei was my favorite species. I'll let you figure out why later on. And then as I got old enough to read, went into middle school, a big discovery was made in the 1970s of the famous Lucy skeleton in Ethiopia. That garnered world attention, and again, I was hooked. So it was unusual for someone to be as interested in human origins as I was. It's not something we tend to get taught about in school a whole lot. There's usually just, sadly, not that much time for it. I went on and got my degree at Duke University, went on, decided I wanted to teach, and wound up in a most remarkable place. I teach at the St. Mark's School of Texas, and I knew it was the school for me when I went about interviewing, and I walked by their science lecture hall, and I saw the 3 skulls you see on the left, which were a gift to St. Mark's from the famed fossil explorer Richard Leakey. And I knew that if a high school was displaying casts of these remarkable fossils, this is a place I needed to be teaching at. And luckily for me, I got the job. At some point when we have more time, I'll tell you about my, shall we say, my interview teaching where I was either going to get the job or get arrested. But we don't have enough time to go into that tonight. But St. Mark, I've been there for 28 years, and it's, to me, a very, very special place. My very first month of teaching, I got called into our headmaster's office. Now, when you're 23-year-old teacher and the headmaster calls you into his office, you kind of wonder, am I about to get fired? What did I do wrong? Who did I upset? And I was told, no, John, we're going to have someone in about a month who's going to come to campus, and you need to prepare your students to teach about this. And I was sitting there going, I was under the impression I wasn't going to be told what to teach so specifically. But you're 23 years old and you're in the headmaster's office. You listen. I was told that a scientist would be coming to campus and I might be interested in this. I might have heard of her. Her name was Jane Goodall. And indeed, she gave me the best teaching advice when I got to meet her. I asked her, what was it about her work with the chimpanzees in Tanzania that captured the world's imagination the way it did? And I remember she looked at me, and when you have a conversation with her, she has an interesting thing. She does not blink like the rest of us do. She stares straight into your eyes. She looks straight into your soul, is how I felt like it was happening. And she said, you know, people remember and treasure the stories that they hear and they learn about as children. And that immediately reminded me of my love of human origins research as a child. And she was absolutely right. And here it was, I, as a middle school teacher, had the opportunity to impact students through not just storytelling, but I like to call it science telling. Let's get the science out there, but the stories behind it are the things that tend to grab us and hold us. And so you see a bunch of skeletons and faces up there. There's a story behind each of these that we could spend an hour on each of them themselves, whether it's the Taung child, the very first ape-man ever discovered in 1925 in South Africa. We have the skeleton to the right, Turkana boy, roughly an 11-year-old boy found on the shores of Lake Turkana, Homo erectus there. If we go to the right, the fleshed out face that looks a little bit different, that's my good friend Paranthropus boisei. Another skull of it right down here on the bottom left. The iconic Lucy skeleton on the far right, and then another Homo erectus skull below that. All neat stories, all discovery stories. And that is what I started to work at in my classes, telling my students the discovery stories of all of these different species, some of which may have led to us, others which clearly didn't. Sometimes the ones that didn't lead to us are more interesting. And we roll up to about 2012, and I had become aware of a new species that had been discovered in a cave in South Africa named Australopithecus sediba. And by the way, if you've noticed my tie tonight, this is a Australopithecus sediba skeleton. It is not Homo naledi. Everyone makes that, so you're in the know now. But the National Geographic explorer in residence and paleoanthropologist Lee Berger here on the left, he and his then 9-year-old son Matthew discovered the bones of 2 skeletons. It's now upwards of 5, in a small cave called Malapa outside of Johannesburg. And it became a big story. However, for me as a middle school teacher here in Texas, I knew the science of it, but the thing that was missing for me was the story behind it. I didn't know what I'm telling you, that his son was actually the one to discover it. And so I needed to find out that story, and it wasn't widely available at the time. So I did an interesting thing, which I've gotten a lot of credit for, but I don't deserve this credit. Because had the outcome been different from what you're about to see, life would have gone on. It was not life or death at the time. I had a conversation with Dr. Berger. It turned out that at some point we had become friends on Facebook. And neither of us remembers how it happened. I'm sure I probably knew his name and friended him, and in a moment of weakness, he clicked, yes, I'll be your friend, because he wouldn't have known who I was. But I saw, if you know Facebook, you know that little green dot that tells you your friends are online. So on August 20th of 2012, at I believe 8:52 p.m., I only know because, no, 8:54 p.m., excuse me. I went back and checked the record, and I asked them the following question. Cheers from Texas, Dr. Berger. Honored to be a Facebook friend. Can I steal a few minutes of your valuable day? Now, I kind of expected that the likelihood of this was to be ignored. I was kind of surprised when I got a 4-letter answer. Sure. I then asked him if he wouldn't mind telling my students the discovery story of Sediba, and that we really wouldn't bother him, an email would probably tell the story. And he said, sure, fine, tell me about your school. And I got about as far as mentioning Dallas. And he said, well, that's interesting because in November, a couple of months later, he said, I'm going to be on a book tour, and I'm going to be taking a couple of days off to visit family in North Texas. And his book that he was touring about was called The Skull and the Rock. There's a copy here in the library. And it's aimed at middle school students, and it's about, guess what? The discovery of Australopithecus sediba. So I was feeling a little bit braver, and I said, wow, maybe we could get you to talk to my students one morning, firmly expecting to hear the voice of Foghorn Leghorn say, I'll say, boy, you bother me, go away now. And instead he said, well, I'd love to, and if we could get a larger audience than your classes, maybe National Geographic will choose to make this an official stop on the book tour rather than just a stop for a family visit. So I thought about it for a moment, and I said, okay, well, maybe we could get our whole middle school, but that really wasn't going to make the audience that much larger. And then I got the idea, well, what about, we had a museum back then, it was in Fair Park, the Museum of Nature and Science, which had recently at that point been reimagined thanks to the work of some great local philanthropists, the Perot family, Lyda Hill, who plays into this story later on. And it was renamed the Perot Museum. So I called them up and I said, would you be interested in having Lee Berger come and visit and talk one evening? And they jumped, oh, yes, that would be wonderful. We'd love that. And then there was kind of this pregnant pause. Oh, but we're moving into our new building, and it won't be ready in November when he comes. So, gosh, we really have to turn it down because we don't have the space. At which point I said, well, why don't we do a nighttime thing at St. Mark's, but brand it for both communities, for the Perot community as well as the St. Mark's family. And they said, yeah, that would be great. Let's do that. And so in November, Lee Berger comes to Dallas. He meets with a bunch of our students, as well as we have a dining hall that looks a lot like the dining hall at Hogwarts. And so we had a wonderful experience there. Over the course of the day, he probably met with or talked to close to 1,000 students. And if you ever get to meet Lee Berger, he is one of the great speakers and storytellers of all time. And at the end of the day, we were having dinner together, and he said, you know, I really wasn't expecting such a warm reception here in, of all places, Texas for this. What we need to do, John, we need to get you down to South Africa so you can actually see and work with the bones of Sediba. Because unlike that boys' club I mentioned earlier, he is a strong believer in the idea of open access. If you have an interest in these fossils, in this science, there's no reason you shouldn't be able to access it and work with it. And so picked my jaw up off the floor, and I did what any normal person would do. I turned him down. Because it just so happened, Tom mentions I do nature photography. I was scheduled to, the week he had suggested, I had signed a contract to be the head of a nature photography camp. Darn. What happens when your passions conflict? Occasionally, life does throw us lemons and we get a chance to make lemonade. And about a month later, well, Lee said, I understand, we'll make time, we'll make it happen some other time, which I knew was his polite way of saying, yes, I'm genuine about it, but we all know it's not really going to happen. And as it turned out, about a month later, I got word that the camp I was going to be working for had decided to close shop. So, ooh, I've lost my summer job. But then, ding-a-ling-a-ling, guess what? There's an opportunity here. So I contacted Dr. Berger, and he said, yep, the offer still stands. And so through a very generous grant from our Parents Association, I was able to go and spend 2 weeks in South Africa and get to actually, if you will, meet Australopithecus sediba here. That's Dr. Berger at the Malapa dig site there. In those crates are the bones of Australopithecus sediba, which I got to work with. And then the kid on the right with the Christmas in July look, that is me holding the original skull of the Taung child, that very first ape-man fossil ever discovered in Africa, the one I had taught about for years and years and years. And Dr. Berger brought me over to it. He had done research on it, got it out of its box, handed it to me and said, here. And I looked at him and I said, I'm not allowed to touch that. He said, why? I said, that's the Taung child. I said, so? I said, no, and he said, I'm in charge of it. It's okay. And so that explains the look on my face. So it was a magnificent, magnificent experience there. And then I come back, I think, okay, life is great. It's now the late summer of 2013. Everything's super. I'm never going to have an experience that's going to top what has happened there, and I'm going to teach my students about this, and it's going to be great. I didn't realize what life had in store, because in October, I believe it was exactly the 13th of October of 2013, 1313 for those of you who are interested in such numbers, these two guys, who are amateur cavers in South Africa, on the left is Stephen Tucker, and on the right is Rick Hunter. They were exploring in a cave outside of Johannesburg. The cave is called the Rising Star Cave. And if you're a caver, it is where you go in South Africa to learn how to cave. Everybody who's spent any time in caves in South Africa has been in that cave. And so they were there. They had been told by Dr. Berger that he was interested in people, cavers, looking for fossils. And if you saw certain things, and he had been generous with his time to alert cavers to certain things to look for, let him know. And so these two guys had gone into this cave, and they had gotten to the end of the map. And they happened to be sitting on a ledge, and they noticed that there was a crack. Now that crack is about as wide as a dollar bill, maybe a little bit more. And it wasn't on the map. And so Rick on the right had the idea, hey, I wonder if we can go down there. Little did they know that what we're going to call the chute, would lead down over 35 feet. Most of the time it would be not much wider than about 8 inches. And they didn't know what it led to, but they were explorers. And so they went down, and here's what they saw. They got to the end of the chute, and there's about a 6-8 foot kind of drop down there. Now, mind you, it was pitch black while they were going down. They just had their headlamps and the like. And they see this chamber that opens up, and we're historically now glad that it was not a 200-foot drop. And if you notice, there's some white specks that jump out at you. You can see here and here, and they thought, those are interesting. They got closer. And does anyone see some human-looking bones? You can see some of the long bones. You can see if you look very closely at this, and I know you don't see it as clearly, but does anyone see a jawbone there? And if you look here, you see part of what looks like kind of a flat but curved bone, maybe part of a skull. And so they realized that this was really interesting. It was either the remains of the last people who had come down and not gotten out, or it was something that someone like Dr. Berger would be interested in knowing about. So they went back and notified Dr. Berger. They had a slight delay because what I'm not going into detail is their camera actually didn't work the first time. Their GoPro ran out of batteries. Lesson, always be prepared with extra batteries in the modern world. But they eventually show these pictures to Berger, and he realizes that this is a really special thing, that these bones are clearly in the human lineage somehow. And he's particularly concerned if you look at some of these, notice how some of these bones have really bright white edges? That's a sign of fairly recent breakage. Someone else had been in that chamber. And the concern was who else was going to get in there. It wasn't on the maps. They have no idea who was in there, but he didn't want to risk that these bones might be damaged and lost forever. So he realized he needed to get a team together to get these out. Now, you've already gotten a hint that these are not easy to get to, right? Now, Dr. Berger is comparable in size to me. I'm not likely to fit into an 8-inch slot. So he realized very quickly that he wasn't going to be someone to be able to see those bones. So he got permission from National Geographic to put a team together, and then he needed to figure out who was going to be on that team. Who could he trust to go down into that space, who had the physical ability to get down there, but also, and just as importantly, if not more importantly, had the skill set to be able to get down there, work there, understand what they were working on, and then safely bring those fossils back up to the surface. So what do you do in that situation? He thought maybe there are 5, 8 people in the world who have the skill set he needed. So he did what you do in the modern world. Oh, I forgot, there's your jawbone up close. He put out an ad on Facebook. And you're not able to read the details of it, but it basically says, colleagues, I'm looking for people with the following skill set. That we can kick this off as early as November 1st of 2013. So we're talking, just a couple weeks after this. And the catch is the person must be skinny, preferably small, not claustrophobic. Have some caving experience. Climbing experience would be a bonus. Willing to work in cramped quarters, be a great team member. I'm willing to look at an experienced PhD student or a well-trained master's student, even though the more experienced, the better. Okay? And then it goes on to say, we'll cover all your costs to get there. We'll cover, put you up in the field in expedition housing, which is scientists speak for tents. And then what has turned out to be the greatest part of the promise is guaranteed collaboration further on down the road. Anyone interested, please contact me. So he had no idea who would reply to this, and winds up getting over 60 people who say, hey, I want to be that person. Narrows it fairly quickly to about a dozen, and then does Skype interviews with those folks to try to ascertain, who would be on the final team. And he narrows that dozen or so down to 6, and all happen to be young women with the scientific skill set that make this possible. And it's a fairly international group. Okay? We have Hannah from left to right, Hannah from the University of Georgia at the time. We have next to her is Marina, who's in charge of the dig currently from Canada. We have in front Becca from American University at the time, although who is now at the Perot Museum as part of our brand new Center of Exploration for the Human Journey. More on that later. We have Ellen from Australia, Aaliyah from the University of Wisconsin, and you always have to have someone from Texas, right? And so we have Lindsay, who was down at the University of Texas at the time. Storyline will come on that she is now in South Africa permanently. More on that later. So they, within weeks, were flown to South Africa, and the dig began. To give you a full sense of what was involved, this is the Rising Star Cave, the entrance being here. There's a vertical shaft that comes down here. The first part of the cave is not that difficult. Most of us in this room could do it if we were not too claustrophobic. I've done a bit of it when I went down to visit. You then have Superman Crawl, which is about 10 inches high. Named Superman Crawl because you need to get your arms up like Superman flies to fit through. And then you go into the Dragon's Back chamber, named for a rock fall here that has rocks sticking out of it that are reminiscent of the scales of a dragon's back. And you get up to the ledge up here where Rick and Steve were that first day, and we have what we call the chute, that vertical 8-inch at its narrowest drop. And then you drop into the Dinaledi chamber, which is a dead-end chamber, no other way into or out of it other than through the chute. And this is something that, with modern caving equipment, took the team in the early days of their exploration the better part of 45 minutes. We've all been mesmerized in the last week by events in Thailand, and I couldn't help but thinking about the folks I've gotten to know on this Homo Naledi team, and while they didn't deal with the water aspect of it, but the tightness and the challenges that are involved there. So most of the month of November 2013, they worked on getting the fossils out. Now, lest you think this was a big dig in terms of space, everything we're going to talk about was excavated from an area about the size, a little bit bigger than the seat you're sitting on, okay? About 80 centimeters by 80 centimeters by 20 centimeters deep. So you might think of it as a small card table, if you will, okay? That, just to put that into perspective. And so the deal was the vast majority of the team was up on the surface, if you will, mission control, and they rigged up cameras and AV equipment so that the 6 scientists who were actually going to be doing the excavation could always be in contact with the senior scientists up on the surface. So that's where you see all the screens, and then along the way, for safety reasons, you had a whole string of cameras and the like, and there were a whole bunch of local South African cavers who dedicated themselves to making sure that the team was safe along the way. Here you get a sense of, this is, in the orange, by the way, in South Africa, if you're wearing an orange jumpsuit, it does not mean you're in prison. Just to, a little cultural difference there. But that is Dr. Berger's daughter, Megan, who's now a senior studying marine biology at the University of Florida. That's what it looks like looking through part of the chute, to give you an idea of how narrow that is. And Megan spent a lot of time as one of the safety cavers. And then over here on the right, you get a view inside what would come to be known as the Dinaledi chamber, Dinaledi being the Sotho word for many stars in honor of the Rising Star Cave. And you can see the work being done there. And part of what the team did is, before they moved anything, they did 3D scans of all the surfaces so that they could virtually reconstruct everything they did, because the excavation of these fossils was going to be a destructive process. It would look different afterward than when they got there. And over the course of most of the month of November, fossils came up. The expectation from those pictures you saw was probably one skeleton, and skeletons are extremely rare in the fossil record. So you don't have but just a couple of sites in Africa where there are more than one skeleton involved. And so the expectation was go in, get one skeleton, and be done, and that would be a world-class discovery. Well, pretty much by the time they found the third right femur, they knew they were onto something, because I challenge any of you to find me any mammal with 3 right legs. And so every bag of fossils that came up was a new and amazing bit of excitement. But remember, these discoveries aren't shared. These are things the world doesn't get to hear about until maybe 5, 10, 15, 20 years later. But because of this amazing team, which, because of the nature of having the excavation scientists down deep underground talking to their mission control on the surface, the nickname came of underground astronauts. It's one the team was not overly fond of, but it's one of those things that stuck. And so here is their, what I think of as their Right Stuff photograph. They're right outside the entrance to the cave there. And just in comparison there, the Gemini astronauts. Now, I've talked about how difficult this is, but my words can't do it justice. But I'm going to let Dr. Berger narrate for you a little bit of this. Is Rick, one of the 2 discoverers of the fossils, showing you what the commute to work was like. And let's see. There we go. And
Rick is going to demonstrate to you, though, that just because we did not kill anyone, that this is every bit as dangerous and extraordinary a risk as has ever been undertaken. These are the easy parts you're looking at. This was an original thing we called Superman crawl, which you go through. I can get through that. So that's not a particularly tight squeeze in the scheme of what we're doing here. For those of you who are squeamish about closed spaces, you may look away because it gets worse. This is the type of journey that these remarkable scientists, the runners, the people who assisted us, would take on a daily basis, usually 3, 4, 5 times a day, getting to these sites. Some people said to me, why haven't you opened this cave up? Well, I hope you can begin to see how fragile this cave is. You do not want to do any opening of caves in that environment, because if you do, you may destabilize the entire system and it could collapse. And secondly, I didn't want to do that. Who was it for me to destroy a cave that's potentially millions of years old just so it could be large enough that my ego could get in there? When there is technology and extraordinary people who have the capability of doing that work today. Here, this is kind of a normal narrow passage, and you're going to see the chute and parts of it here, and you'll get an idea of the depth as you see Steve Tucker's light in the distance as we look down into the chute, and you get an idea of how narrow those spaces are that they are traversing down. You'll see how dangerous some of the loose rocks are. This rock that Rick is about to touch actually fell on a National Geographic photographer and shattered his fingers as he was under there. Oh, and Rick can dislocate his shoulders. Watch. I just show you that for fun.
So you get an idea that this was not easy work. And to this day, knowing what has come out of that cave, I am regularly grateful to everybody who made those trips back and forth, with minimal injury, thankfully, to bring out the amazing collection of bones that is Homo naledi. Now, I mentioned to you this idea that we're not allowed usually to know about these discoveries until they're published, and certainly not while they're being excavated. And here's a case where Dr. Berger's dedication to the idea of open access made a difference. The team started to live tweet every day what was going on at the dig site. It would be literally, oh, Becca's bringing up a bag with this in it. Oh, we think we have this down in the chamber. We're not sure how we're going to get it out. We have to work around this. Those discussions we were aware of that. And I would sit with my morning class in Dallas and be aware of that while the team was wrapping up their day in South Africa, those darn tricky time zone things. And it was fantastic. We were able to tweet back some of our questions to the team while they were working and get responses literally within minutes. Unheard of. But I had a problem with my afternoon classes. Of course, by the time it was, say, 2:30, 3 o'clock in Dallas, it was nighttime or late evening in South Africa, and the cave activity had shut down. So I found myself going through the Twitter feed from the morning to tell my students what had been going on. Not quite the same experience. And I realized, I got home that first night and I realized all of this amazing stuff that's happening is going to kind of disappear into the Twitter sphere. And remember, this is 2013, so we had not ventured into the world of Twitter that we may know today. A tweet, once it was out there, no one was interested in looking it up, what someone had said on Twitter 2 days before even. So I knew that these were going to just kind of vanish for all practical purposes. And so I got the idea that why don't I, when I got home, stay up and pull together all the relevant tweets for the day and make videos of them so that we would then have that as sort of a primary source. And I knew that there were going to be, this was big enough, there were going to be other students and teachers who were interested in this. They just didn't have the luck to be aware of it while it was happening. So the idea to create a repository of these tweets. So that's what I did, call it my Twitter play-by-play. And basically, it's up on my blog, and there'll be an address for that later. You can go and actually relive the day-to-day excavations with my sometimes very monotonous narration behind it, telling you, why this is important, why this is interesting, because I assumed that the audience for this was not going to be PhD scientists. One of my favorite examples of this was Lindsay Eves, her name at the time, that has changed, more on that later. She had posted on her personal Facebook page a long story about the day they got the first skull out. And if you're a Harry Potter fan, you'll appreciate this. She had titled it Accio Skull Day. Bring me the skull. And I read this and I was mesmerized. I was like, this is great. And so I messaged her. I said, could I kind of read your post into my nightly thing? And she said, sure, you're welcome to do that. But how about if I just record it on my phone here in South Africa and email it to you? Well, yeah, that makes a lot more sense. So she did, and about 20 minutes later, I had an 8-minute clip of her telling this story, which then made it into my morning class about 8 hours later. Okay? Welcome to the modern age of communication, and ways in which we can use social media to make a very significant difference in the teaching of science, but of anything, really. And so that was really, really special. And so that was the Twitter play-by-play as it happened. And the team wrapped up, remember that size of the fossil dig? A card table, right? They wound up getting over 1,500 fossils out of that very small area, representing over 15 individuals, ranging in ages from infants to the elderly. Just an unheard of collection, certainly the largest fossil collection, human fossil collection ever in Africa. So this was clearly a big deal. And again, the public generally is unaware of it at this point. But the problem is they had too many fossils. They had to now take the time to figure out what they had. They knew they had a lot. They knew they were fairly unique. But analyzing 1,500 fossils is not a job for a couple of people. So with this idea of open access and to kind of open the doors of academia a little bit more, kick them open, if you will, a little bit, Berger and his team said, what we're going to do is we're going to do what other sciences are doing, especially in genetics. We're going to bring in the best and the brightest in our field, especially the best and the brightest young minds. In May of 2014, they had what they called the Rising Star Workshop in Johannesburg, and they divided up the body into regions. There was the hand group, the skull group, the chest group, the leg group, the spine group. And if you were a researcher on any of those body parts and you were interested, you were interviewed, and they selected a group of several dozen researchers to fly down to South Africa, and they spent a good chunk of May getting to know each other and actually working with the initial fossils to actually have a sense of what they had. So this wasn't just a couple of big-name scientists, hoarding their fossils and saying, we've got them, and they're really cool and none of you can see them. No, they were bringing in the best folks they could. It was a really, really neat way to open things up. Fast forward now to November, and Dr. Berger thought they might be able to publish by then, which would have been about a year from the actual excavation, which would be unheard of. The usual time in this field, why it's 5 years, would not be considered unusual for a tooth. Okay? Obviously, they had a lot more than a tooth. They had over 200 teeth, to be precise. So he came to visit St. Mark's again, and he thought he was going to be able to tell us a lot. It turns out he had to kind of hold off on some things, but he was able to share photographs with us. And this is where we got to see some of the first complete feet in the human fossil record. There were multiple nearly complete feet. Hands, again, almost unheard of in any other species, but this was such a rich collection of these fossils. You just had the amazing completeness, including one hand that was still in its death grip when it was discovered. The bones were, a fancy word, articulated, meaning they were all still together. Absolutely incredible. The lower jaw and partial upper jaw, perfect fit together. The cranium of what is referred to as DH1, Dinaledi hominid 1. You can see it's missing the mid part of the face, but otherwise remarkably complete. So this was amazing, but the public still didn't know a whole lot because it hadn't been published. And then I got an invitation to come back to South Africa in 2015 to share, to learn more, and to hopefully build some more resources. So I got my chance to go visit the cave, which I felt like I had lived in through those days in November 2013. So I got my chance to go in. I didn't get to go very far for security reasons. The cave had been secured, so there was limited access, as it should be. But here you can see the large vertical shaft in there. And I had the opportunity to meet this amazing group of people on the right. Because one of the things Berger realized is that if this fossil discovery was in the most well-known of all South African caves, right under everybody's nose, what else was out there? What are we missing that's in our own backyard? And so he put together a team of explorers to go, and their job now, on a daily basis, and they're still at it, is to explore looking for more fossils throughout South Africa, primarily in the cradle of humankind around Johannesburg, but that is their job. And they have made a bunch of other discoveries, most of which I'm not allowed to talk about yet, but there will be more cool stuff coming, trust me, as you will see. And so I got to spend time with them, which was eye-opening to me. And the really cool thing I got to do was I got the idea that we need to be having discussions with these folks, and we need them to be widely available. Because even with whatever news was going to come of this, our news cycle is little tidbits. Find for me anything that's more than 30 seconds. How do you learn in 30-second tidbits? As a teacher, that bothers me greatly. So I wanted to have conversations with the people who were doing this. So I had the opportunity during my time in South Africa to interview all the members of the exploration team. Dr. Berger, Dr. Hawks, his number 2 in charge. Then I reached out, and the original 6 expedition scientists, the underground astronauts, if you were, they were in various places by this time. But I reached out to them, and they were all gracious and willing to talk to me. And so I wound up having over a dozen interviews that I was able to put up on my blog and share with the world, so that as people became aware of this, they'd be able to dig deeper. It wouldn't be a 30-second soundbite world. But here came the toughest part of this for me. I do all of this, and I know all of the stuff I've learned. This is the summer of 2015, July of 2015. It's not going to be announced until September. I have to keep my mouth shut. And my lovely wife will tell you that is hard for me to do. But I did. And I think part of the bribe from Dr. Berger was a gift of the Sadiba tie. And then finally in September, the announcement came. And it happened, I believe it was September 10th, and took the world by storm. Was the front page of the New York Times, the front page of all the major news outlets. Now, the New York Times is a funny thing. If you're a human fossil expert out there, and I'm going to go on the assumption that most of you are not, the New York Times made a little bit of an oopsie on this one. That's not Homo naledi, okay? That is a fossil called Mrs. Plez. They fixed their mistake within about 15 minutes, but it was an interesting thing there. But here's a layout of the highlights of the collection of Homo naledi. Not all 1,500, but you get a sense of what's out there and how shockingly complete it is. And then within 2 weeks of his announcement in South Africa, he was back in Texas. And part of what had transpired along the way is that a woman in Dallas who is become near and dear to my heart here for what she's done for science. Many of you know Lyda Hill. She played a huge role in the support of the Perot Museum, one of the founding benefactors there. And she was aware that this Rising Star Cave, which, by the way, those 1,500 bones, there are thousands more still in the cave that they deliberately left behind. 1,500 was enough to get started with. But the cave was privately owned by a landowner who was more than willing to make it available, but you're not guaranteed that that's going to happen in the future. So through her generosity, funds were made available, and the land that the cave itself was able to be purchased and put into a trust to preserve it for scientific research in perpetuity. So Texas has a very, very special part in this whole story yet again. And so Dr. Berger comes back to Texas. He visits with me and my students, and he's the only person who's ever made me cry in front of 300 middle school boys when he presented me with one of the very first cast skulls, the one that's actually out in our display case there, on the day he came and spoke to us. And my students will have great pride in telling you that our school got our Naledi cast before the Smithsonian got theirs. There's nothing really that special about it other than his travel itinerary had him in Dallas before Washington. But it was an amazing thing to have this come to us so close. So I've talked a lot about the discovery factors, but what is Homo naledi? It's the most intriguing mix of primitive characteristics and surprisingly modern. So just to give you a rundown on this graphic, first of all, this is a recreation of the skull by the very famous paleo artist named John Gurche, who, if you go to the Smithsonian in their Hall of Human Origins, you'll see all of his casts and busts and sculptures there. He is one of my heroes for his blend of art and science. And I can't help but think that Ms. McDermott, with her love of art and science, would have appreciated this a great deal as well. But on the left side here, you can see features for the genus Homo, the modern side of things. The skull, while being very small, the brain size is less than half that of yours or mine, the shape of it was surprisingly modern looking. Then you move down, the hands certainly seem capable of making and using stone tools. No stone tools were found with the bones, but the anatomy suggests that they certainly were capable of it. Very similar to ours. The big difference you'd notice in these hands is the fingers are slightly more curved, which probably a good adaptation for climbing, whether it be in caves, trees, the like. Long legs for the size of the body. Again, the males were maybe 5'4", the females right at about the 5-foot range, so they were overall much smaller than us as modern humans. And then the feet were almost indistinguishable from modern human feet. If I were to take the cast of the foot that's out in the display case and I were to show that to a modern podiatrist, they'd say, yeah, there are a couple of interesting things here, but it's convincingly human. Yet on the other side, there's some very primitive Australopithecine, even ape-like features. The size, certainly the size of the brain, okay? The pelvis was a little bit more flared out, more like a Lucy-style pelvis, still able to walk upright, no problem, but not ape-like at all. The shoulders were a fascinating thing. They're much more like a gibbon's shoulders. And if you look at a gibbon, they spend almost all their lives suspended from trees and swinging. So that adds to this climbing aspect of things. And then I've already mentioned the curved fingers. So basically it seemed like anything that came in contact with the environment seemed to be surprisingly modern, but some of the core of the skeleton tended to be maybe a little bit more primitive. So, and then on the right side there, you get a sense of the kind of the ghost outline is a modern human skull, and then the Homo naledi DH1 skull superimposed on that. So you get a sense of the size differences there. But more than the fossils themselves, the big question became, how did they get in there? It was so hard for the team of scientists to get in there. How were these primitive beings, and the idea from that anatomy, it initially suggested maybe they were 1 million, 2 million years old. There was no date discovered early on. We'll get to that in a little bit. But so at this point in time, we didn't know how old these bones were. So how did they get in there? They clearly didn't have modern technology that our team did to get in there. So let's look at the facts. They had more than 15 individuals represented in that dead-end chamber. They ranged in ages from infants all the way up through the elderly, both males and females. No obvious cause of death. You look at all of these bones, they weren't killed by predators. They clearly weren't killed in sort of a cave collapse or a catastrophic sort of situation there. You know, you had the hands and feet articulated, which meant when those bones got to that, were in that spot, they still had their flesh on them. As I said, no predator damage, and I should add to that, no scavenger damage. You go to a cave in South Africa, you find bones of any sort, they've almost all been gnawed on by some scavenger, whether it's hyenas or porcupines or who knows what. The bones hadn't been moved by water. Those hands and feet with those tiny little bones were still intact. Okay? And that's something that bones normally on the surface, wind and water moves them around very easily. There were no sediments in this cave that did not come from the walls and ceiling of that chamber. You know, there was no leaf litter in there. There was nothing that didn't belong. There were no tools, no stone tools, no debris, no signs that this had been some sort of a living quarter. And then the most unusual thing is there were effectively no other bones of any other species represented. There were a couple of mouse teeth and part of a very modern, part of a bird wing. But that was it. And again, in an African cave collection of bones, you usually get a whole bunch of different species represented. So this was very, very odd. And so the question is, where would we find this in the modern world? And the team dug through this idea and looked at how could they have gotten in? Could it have been a cave collapse? Water, all of these things there, and constantly the evidence kept saying, no, that idea can't work. This idea can't work. This idea can't work. My best example of this was not long after this came out, I was doing a Skype presentation with a school group in New Jersey, and they were having kind of a STEM day, and they had a forensic police officer there. And he didn't know anything about this story. So we brought him in, and before I revealed what the hypothesis that this team came up with, I had him, I kind of recruited him on the spot and said, you're a forensic police officer. If you were to find this and someone were to report this to you, what would you make of this? And he asked a couple of clarifying questions. The students in the audience did as well. And then he said, well, the only idea I have is kind of ridiculous for this. But if this were in a modern time, the only place where you would see lots of people of all age ranges, males and females, all of that, without other species being present, is a modern-day graveyard. And that's the hypothesis that the team came up with. That somehow this very, very small hominid with a brain the size of an orange was depositing their dead in this incredibly remote chamber, one that would be very, very difficult, if, dare I say, nearly impossible, for living Homo naledi to get to. But every other idea that was brought up, there was evidence that knocked it down. And so that is the hypothesis that the team announced that this was. And a lot of people will call it burial. We're very careful not to use that, but the idea of what is called ritualized body disposal. The idea that on a repeated basis, bodies were brought in, and there was evidence to suggest that these bodies weren't all put there at one time. They were brought there certainly probably over the span of at least decades, if not longer. And they were put there for what reason, what the reasoning is, hard to know. It certainly strains credulity to think that this was let's get dead bodies away from us so the predators aren't attracted. There are ways of doing that that don't involve risking life and limb to get into a deep underground chamber like that. So that was the proposal, and as you might imagine, many people came back and asked all the questions that are probably going through your mind, but the only thing that is left as kind of an exclusionary hypothesis is the idea that this was a place where the dead were deposited. So the big excitement is going on, and we want to be able to share this and teach people about this, and this is one of the great things for me as a teacher that Dr. Berger did, the idea of open access. How can we push that door open even wider? Well, technology allows us to scan these bones, all of which have been scanned in 3D scanners, and now anybody who wants to, who has access to a 3D printer, can print out most of the Homo naledi fossils. And when you go out to the display case, you'll be able to see some of mine. These are 4 of mine. And this is one of my favorite photographs. You can see the actual fossil on the left and the 3D print of mine on the right. So I can have my students, and indeed any students, can be handling these fossils, measuring them, learning from them, and that's a really special thing that, again, would not have been possible were it not for the idea of open access. We're not done yet, though. This is the favorite part for me, is that this discovery story keeps going. And so notice May 2017. Some of the questions, are there more bones? And the answer to that turns out to be yes. At the end of the first expedition in 2013, there is a discovery of a second chamber down a completely different pathway. If you imagine that maybe this auditorium represents the Dinaledi chamber, and for those of you who know this library, there's another chamber that's found equally hard to get to, but that may be down over where the kids section of the library is. You know, a very different pathway to get there. No connection there. And they find a new skeleton. You can see it over here on the right. They name it Neo, which means gift in the Sutu language. And it's absolutely fascinating. It's as complete, if not perhaps more complete, than the famous Lucy skeleton. And you can see here, this purple area represents the entrance to the cave. The Dinaledi chamber is down here, as I mentioned. And then the Lesedi chamber is up over here. Okay, so in a very different part of the cave. And then the age. Everyone was saying, you know, oh, how old is this? We need to get this idea. Well, dates finally came in from multiple labs, and it was dated to between 236,000 and 335,000 years old. Surprisingly young. This is a species that may well have overlapped with modern humans in that part of South Africa, which opens up a whole nother range of questions. Gosh, if you find stone tools from that part of South Africa, who made them? We've always assumed modern humans made them. But now maybe we have to ask deeper questions there. So keep going. That was May of 2017. Now September of 2017, almost the entire original team reconvenes to do more work. And this is what I love. They're still testing hypotheses. This is not a, hey, we found everything. We have all the answers. Let's, clean our hands, clean our jumpsuits, and we're done. No, this is ongoing science, which again for me as a teacher is fascinating stuff. And so they worked in both chambers to recover more of that Neo skeleton to see if underneath the chute there was a cone of debris. They needed to look at that and say, if our hypothesis of dropping skeletons or bodies down there is true, in this cone of debris, there should be bodies. There should be Homo naledi bones there, because the original dig site was a number of meters away from that, and the floor of the cave slopes enough that the idea was that the bodies dropped down and would have slumped into where they were discovered. So that needed to be investigated. And maybe there's a new surprise, you just don't know. So what did they find in September 2017? They found more evidence of Homo naledi in the Dinaledi chamber, but in a weird way. And this I'm going to go to a larger view. If you look here just to get your bearings, here's where the chute is. Can everyone see where I'm at there? That's the chute. So here was the 2017 excavation. They were looking at the pile of stuff under the chute. There's that card table I talked about right here, the original excavation. But then they found bits of Homo naledi in some very unusual places. Places that are basically, even for the folks who can get into the chamber in the first place, places that are very difficult to get into. I believe this is Stephen Tucker here. You can see here, he's had to take off his helmet to get himself into this spot, okay? And this is one of these side spots. So how did those fossils get where they are? Did they come in alive? And this is where, in trying to find their way out, they wound up? Certainly worth considering. Is there, again, the question has always been, is there another entrance? And there's no suggestion of that. So this is current, ongoing work that needs answers. And those answers hopefully will be coming up. And then the outreach for this team. This is, again, the amazing thing. Some of the things they did, they continue to live tweet when they're in the cave. One of my favorite things is their most recent time, they've had local Africans tweet in African languages so that local South African folks can understand what's going on here. They've put Wi-Fi throughout the whole cave so that they can now broadcast from in the cave while they're working. Okay? And they video chat with anyone in the world. Okay? They did a Facebook Live in their last thing that had over 40,000 viewers. And I'm going to share with you a little short video clip here. They visited St. Mark's from the cave. And yeah, can you all make that bigger?
We sure can. Hello, St. Mark's. It is fantastic to see you all, and we're really looking forward to being with you in just about 3 weeks from now. You're going to see a lot of the scientists that are going to be with us on our way to Dallas, Texas, and we really can't wait to be back at one of our favorite schools in the whole world. You'll actually see that we have a network of TV cameras and communication systems that are designed to let us communicate with those chambers deep underground so that we always have contact with the scientists.
About how often do you find a fossil in any chamber?
Found one just then.
Yeah, really?
Yes.
Who found it? So Ellen has just made a discovery of a fossil as you asked that question. What is it, Ellen?
A bit of a rib fragment.
Fantastic. So to answer your question, we're very fortunate here in the Dinaledi and Lesedi chamber in finding hominid fossils all the time. All right, boys. Well, it is great. We cannot wait to see you. See you in just a little bit there at St. Mark's. We look forward to seeing Dallas, and thanks for joining us.
All right. So you can see the excitement of being able to have having that sort of a connection. And they weren't just doing it with us, they were doing it with schools really all the way around the world, which was amazing. National Geographic's Classroom Explorer is a new program that they put out that connects scientists in all sorts of fields, not just this one, with classes on four continents here, and for all on literally every day there's something with National Geographic Explorer Classroom, which is fantastic. And finally, the last bit of work that was done, most recently just a couple of months ago. A small section of the team returned, and what they worked to do, they wanted to get more of that debris from that cone, what they called the mash, which is kind of a mash of bones. They had found bones in that previous visit, and they were able then to dig a little bit deeper, and they'll be announcing some of the results that come out of that. But the word is that there are more interesting bones in those blocks that were taken out, which were a challenge. They worked to get more of the neoskeleton, recording high-resolution video to do a virtual reality project, more on that in a second, and then, of course, more outreach across the world. So Homo naledi is a lot closer here in North Texas than you may think. And this is something I am really excited about, because from the beginning of this project, the Perot Museum has played a big role in this, and I am really excited that in the last few months, the Perot has created a Center for Exploration for the Human Journey, basically to give a presence for human origins research and teaching here in North Texas, based at the Perot Museum. And it'll work on science communication in this field, as well as teaching and better understanding the newest discoveries about Homo naledi in particular, but also everything new that comes out. And then here's the cool thing, that tomorrow you can do this. You can go to the Perot, to their new Being Human Hall, and they have a virtual reality tour that you can take. You see me there with my, actually guys, could you play that for me? I'm having trouble there. Here you can see, this is me with it. It's quite funny to watch myself. But you are actually in virtual reality in the cave. You get to pick up fossils. You get a full immersive experience. And the thing I love about it is the scientists who were involved in all the fossil recovery were also the ones who filmed the virtual reality footage and played a very, very significant role in making it come to fruition. So it's there currently at the Perot. So go down tomorrow, next week, you can do that. And for the kids that you know who are going back to school in the fall, there's a really cool thing. Open access. You've heard that's been a theme tonight, hasn't it? I'm happy to be able to tell you, thanks to the work of the Perot team and Dr. Berger, that this fall they will be releasing that virtual reality footage so that anybody, free of charge, can access it. You'll be able to download it. If you have a virtual reality headset, you're set. And they're making it available in multiple language. I think last I heard was 6 different language tracks will be available. So this is an unheard of opportunity to make this available for teachers and students, to literally between the 3D fossils, the curricular materials, and the virtual reality side of this. There's never been a fossil discovery that you can bring into the classroom like this, and that's something I've written about on my National Geographic blog, which if you want to follow up on things here a little bit, bunch of links, and I'll leave this up, but I have my blog for the play-by-play and the interviews. National Geographic and NOVA did a 2-hour documentary called The Dawn of Humanity. They've made that available to the world on YouTube, so you don't need to go out and buy it, although you can if you want the disc of it. Your 3D printed fossils, available on morphosource.com, which is, I'm happy to say, run by my alma mater at Duke University. I'm glad to see them playing a role in this. Then my blog, my column that I write for the blog is there. And rather than worry about that long thing, if you just Google Nat Geo and John Mead, it'll pull up my author page. So that's probably the easiest thing there. And then Dr. Berger's very active on Twitter. You've heard a lot of Twitter talk here. This is the fun side of Twitter. Okay. Dr. Berger, the Perot Museum Center for Exploration of the Human Journey. They have a brand new Twitter account as of earlier this summer. I encourage you all to follow there. And then my Twitter, I'm at Evo_Explorer. And then my email, if you have questions that don't get answered tonight or you hear stuff, meet at smtexas.org. And I also have a YouTube channel as well, youtube.com/jsmead. And yep, so I want to leave that up, but I know Tom has a question he's been dying to ask me. So, okay.
We'll start at the beginning. I'm sure there's a lot of questions, but before we get started, and sometimes the question and answer is better than the presentation, but how can you top that?
Thank you.
I'm so impressed we have so many children here tonight. That means we got future archaeologists and paleontologists, paleo-archaeologists. But y'all stand just a second. All kids, students, whatever. Mm-hmm. Isn't that amazing?
All right.
I want to thank the Friends of the Allen Public Library for putting this on, and we'll start with questions, comments, protests. This is a library, you can say what you want. Okay.
Do you know anything about, like, maybe the sexual dimorphism between the male and female of the Homo naledi species?
Excellent question. Can everyone hear the question there? About sexual dimorphism, the difference between males and females. Pretty much it fits what I would call a human pattern. There is some, but not nearly as significant as you would find in some of the earlier Australopith species.
I don't know, because I was raised on a farm. The females always did the work.
So clearly they were quite a bit smaller than us, but still they would have had a squeeze to get through those places. So I'm wondering if you found any evidence of ropes or torches, or it got awful dark down there, I'm sure.
Excellent question, and that is one of the ongoing bits of work. There's no evidence of any tools of any kind. The team thinks if they're going to find any evidence of how it would be signs of fire. And so they've been excavating and looking along the passageways and the like for evidence of charcoalization and the like. Part of the concern there is, given how widely this cave has been used over decades, the concern that some of that may have been lost to that. But that is ongoing, but nothing has been discovered to my knowledge yet.
This is not a terribly scientific question, but when you first began and you showed the sort of the map of going here and going there, and then that long drop, you had to be no more than 8 inches to get there.
Right, at its narrowest spots. There were spots that were wider
Now,
than that.
Maybe I missed something, but how did they get out when they went back to have dinner, relax, sleep, and then go back the next day? How did they get out?
One of the things is they were put some ladders at the very beginning of the chute from the chamber going out, if we're going on the way home. And basically, and each of the 6 scientists who worked in there had a slightly different way of doing it, but it basically, you squeezed yourself up and then you'd literally shimmy up and pushing, if you can hear me, a lot of it is, because you're so tightly squeezed in that you're basically pushing and squeezing, and then you'd wedge yourself in by inhaling, and that would keep you from sliding down. Okay? But yeah.
What is it about the composition of bones that prevents them from turning to dust after 300,000 years?
Good question. Good question. In part, I think one of the things that probably was a saving grace for the preservation of these bones, as opposed to, and probably wasn't so good, say, for DNA, is this cave is, and I don't think I mentioned it, it's very moist. Okay, while there's not any standing water in it, relative humidity is very high. So your bones basically did not turn to dust in the same way because you had that high level of humidity over time.
What was the state of society and basically the world while it was when the bodies were deposited, and how did it affect how the things were preserved and stuff?
So basically, when these bones came into the chamber, we're talking, somewhere in that range of, I'll just loosely say, around 300,000 years ago to pick a kind of midpoint there. Modern humans were just, people who were out there that looked like you and me, were just coming into being. So society as we know it was probably much more of a tribal sort of grouping. We think when we look at Homo naledi, and we know very little, if anything, about their social structure and the like. The bones, regardless of age, show so much similarity that it suggests they were probably genetically a very closely related population. Does that answer your question? And one thing I'll follow up on that because I can tell there's a natural lead-in from that is, what about the DNA? If we think they're closely related, what about DNA? The team has consistently been trying to get DNA, but with no success yet. So, and I just saw one of our team members posted something yesterday that confirmed that as well. So but that is ongoing.
Just one more
Sure.
question real quick. Do you think that whatever kind of burial thing that was had anything to do with like an early type of religion?
If I sit as a scientist on that, it's a great question, and one I think everyone here in the room can have their own take on. From an evidence perspective, there's no way to know one way or another on that. So I think a lot of us would form our own opinions on that based on where we're coming from. But
I think we have a future scientist.
Yep,
Yes, when you first started talking, and I'm going to get the name wrong, you were talking about Homo cybex?
Oh no, Australopithecus sediba.
Sediba,
The first,
yeah.
the first
Okay.
description.
And somewhere I missed the relationship between that and Homo naledi.
Sediba, for the purposes of the story, not necessarily the science, Sediba was the species that Berger and his son discovered originally in 2009. Sediba is dated at almost precisely 2 million years ago, and it's a more primitive Australopith. So it has a brain still smaller, a body much more adapted for the climbing aspect of things.
What was the geological, or is the geological makeup of the cave? Is it limestone? What
Yeah,
kind of
this is a karst system throughout the cradle of humankind. So. These are great questions. I appreciate it.
Was that cave, has that been the same for 300,000 years? Nothing has changed?
When you look at the geology, certainly let's look at the chamber, the Dinaledi chamber. The geology of that says that has been very stable over that time. Now, one of the big questions that goes is, the idea of access. And while there may have been some of the passageways may have been a bit different in the past, the feeling is that chamber's always been in the dark zone and probably always been very difficult to get to. You may not have had to go through, say, Superman crawl 300,000 years ago, but it was still a very, very difficult access.
Well, you said that was a rock fall that
Possibly the dragon's back part, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So if that hadn't fallen, then the access would have been a lot easier?
Possibly, although the feeling is the chute was the way in, based on the fact that we have that cone of debris at the bottom of the chute. That seems to be supportive of how the bodies were getting in there.
In these very primitive societies, do you find a pattern of burial of the dead, or is that something that's not,
When we go back this far, the oldest burials we have are back about 100,000 years ago that we feel really certain can be looked at and said, these are burials. And we have some Neanderthal burials. So going back here to, let's say, again, I'm broadly using 300,000 years as my ballpark number here. It really pushes it back in time, and you're also saying, wow, we have a species here with a very small brain, and what does that mean? And that's a whole nother set of questions that come out of that.
Because I wonder if it could be, rather than a formalized burial, a cultish group that may have hidden there together because of whatever, exterior problems, and died that way.
Right, and that's one of the things the team looked at is, was this some sort of we'll call it a refuge. Right. There's no evidence of any habitation there, any long-term living, any sort of trash, food waste, any sort of things like that that suggest that these individuals were spending living time there. So, good question. Yeah, question up on the...
Well, when we're heading back here,
okay.
If y'all have any program, I can tell by the interest in the audience that this archaeology, paleoarchaeology and paleontology is very fascinating or very popular with the audience. If you have any program ideas, let me know.
In the debris field, would there be any way, would it be only through DNA analysis of any residue of soft tissue, skin, organs, blood, etc.?
Because of both kind of the warmth and humidity, I'm not aware of any organic preservation at this point. The team hasn't reported on that, but that is something that is definitely of interest.
Thank you very much. This is a great presentation. Such a thrill.
Thanks.
Two questions. One, some apes, I believe, have bones that attach their head to their shoulders. Is there any evidence that was any of that found, or?
Do you know which bone are you?
I don't remember the name. No, I'm sorry, because the shoulders are so different than human.
The shoulder, without being too precise on this, ape shoulders are broadly similar to ours. It's a matter of the range of motion and how much of the idea of a ball and socket, and the ape shoulders tend to have less of that socket, which allows for a wider rotation. But there's no specific connection to the skull there.
Okay. And then second question is, how, for the research team, how is the air down there? How is the oxygen content?
That's a good question. I remember, and this in some of the early tweets that were coming out, that was one of the great concerns, is because you were in this limited chamber, so they brought down carbon dioxide alarms, because the feeling was you're going to have a group of 2 or 3 scientists working in there for an extended period of time of several hours, and the concern was if carbon dioxide levels built up, and since carbon dioxide is colorless and odorless, you really may not notice until it's too late. I think they had one false alarm early, it may have been on the very first day, that caused great consternation, but it never turned out to be a problem after that. So it was a concern, but it turned out to be no big deal. So.
Well, I'm going back to the next question. John is being very gracious and humble. He had a lot to do with this.
1,500 fossils representing some 15 individuals.
Let me stop you just for a second there. We can probably up that now to over 1,800 fossils with probably 18 individuals.
Okay.
So,
what was the methodology, and to what degree of confidence is there that, is it even reasonable to say that this femur and this tibia here come from the same person? Or are you just trying to find bones that are representative of the individual and just get enough of them to create as complete a skeleton as you can?
Superb question. I can tell you've thought about this for a while. I think the name of, the area that I mentioned, that card table excavation spot, a part of that was referred to by the team as the puzzle box, because the bones were so mixed up there. So for some of them, it is difficult to tell exactly who they belong to, but with most of the bones, you get a sense of, based on size and age and the like, you can narrow things down. Some of the, like that hand I mentioned, clearly that hand all belonged to one individual, but getting that with, say, its humerus, for instance, is a bit harder that way. But you're able, because of you have differences in individuals, you're able to narrow things down really well, but not necessarily always to individual people. Does that make sense? Cool.
In this case, as you've emphasized, you had a relative treasure trove of samples of different fossils that could be linked to different individuals. You mentioned that in many other cases in paleoarchaeology, you don't have that situation.
Mm-hmm.
In science, we like to have many things that we like to have large sample sizes and that we can replicate different outcomes. So in other digs and other discoveries other than this, when we like to have that enough statistical confidence. You may have it here, but what about in other situations?
This dig brings up one of the challenges in the field. When you have very little fossilization of certain things and, hey, look, I found one fossil, I found a scrap, and this scrap could make my career. Is there a tendency for me to want to make a bigger deal out of it than might be deserving? And that at times has happened. And one of the things this shows, and Berger and the team have been very clear about, it's great that we have such a wide sampling here and we have a wide range of skeletal material to go with. It points out that we need to be careful about what sort of conclusions we draw from some of the past discoveries that are much more scattered. So, and that's not always something people want to hear, but it's a good thing for us as scientists to be aware of. Down here? Oh, yeah.
Hi. My question is thinking about the fact that there's about 18 people represented in that cave, and I've never seen, a cemetery with that few people in it. I just wonder if there was some reason someone went to such a great effort to stick people's bodies down there, wondering if they had infectious diseases, things that show up in Africa like Ebola.
Right. When the analysis of the bones, and the bones are, of course, all we have to go on, there's no evidence of looking at the bones and saying, oh, here's a cause of death. That would be really helpful if there was. But for these, on none of them are there any obvious causes of death. And again, you have the full age spectrum from literally infants where teeth have not yet erupted out of their jaws to the elderly, but no evidence of cause of death. So that's something that we wish we had, but unfortunately don't. So.
I heard a lot of talk about the biological material found, and you alluded to we may have to reassess tools found on the surface. Were there any tools found in the cave?
No tools whatsoever found in the cave. So one of the challenges is, and a lot of this, especially as we talk about, the idea that this is a body disposal place, we want to dig deeper into the meaning of it, and there's not a whole lot of evidence that helps us latch onto that yet. So there are no tools, no signs of fire and the like. So does that make sense?
Over here in the balcony.
Thank you. I'm curious, what's the outside climate like at the cave site? Is it dry like Arizona? Are you in a rainforest?
The climate of the Johannesburg area is, I like to think of it as kind of an interesting mix of Dallas and Denver. It's a little bit more elevated on a plateau, more like Denver that way. But it's a very dry grassland environment.
So has the team considered its karstic topography, and has the team considered, okay, you've got 18 individuals you've found parts of. Has the team considered looking at trying to find potential living sites, middens, in order to find, perhaps the erosion in 300,000 years isn't too great. you might be able to find surface evidence of these people?
I think that's certainly part of the exploration team is, that's part of why they exist, is to be able to take a look at that. One other issue is that this area of South Africa is fairly, you're literally, it would be the equivalent of the Rising Star Cave would be about as far from downtown Johannesburg as we are from downtown Dallas. So it's a surprisingly well-developed suburban environment. Now, luckily, the Cradle of Humankind, where this cave is a World Heritage Site, so it has been preserved. So there is the possibility to look at that, but a lot of the landscape has been ranched and farmed and the like.
And also, is this considered to be a live cave, or is it a dead cave?
Certainly in the closer to the surface, it's very much a live cave, but when you go deep into the dark zone, like this chamber, it's effectively a dead cave.
Okay. Thank you.
We'll take 2 more questions. I think I saw a hand down in the middle there.
I got one down here.
I think I saw, he's one of our youngest guests, because he'll get a chance.
And Tom, thanks for getting your extra steps in today.
My heart thing.
You said that you don't know a cause of death. What if it's hunger?
That's a good question, although on the skeletons, probably not going to, 300,000 years ago, there's probably not going to be a sign on the skeletons that would tell us that, because actually they probably wouldn't have died so much from hunger as from a lack of water, which would have killed them more rapidly than hunger. It would take probably the better part of a month to die from hunger, whereas within a few days you die from thirst, and that would not leave any significant signs on your skeleton. But that's a super question.
Is it possible that they had tried to seal up the cave, and that's why the passage was so small, and then the people who tried to seal it up got lost?
No evidence at this stage, and understand that most of this cave had been explored by cavers on a very regular basis, because this is a very popular recreational cave. So all those passages were as open as they could get, kind of. Yep.
I know you mentioned that the group of women that he ended up selecting to go in to do this excavation were, he handpicked them and they were experienced, but I was wondering if past cave exploration, like the Dmanisi caves or like in Indonesia with the Homo florensis, had any kind of impact on, kind of what they knew going into what they needed to do, since they were both cave. I know the one in Indonesia was very surface level, but if those had anything to do with how they carried out. I'm going to school for anthropology.
Yes, I was going to say, you are incredibly well informed, and that is good to see.
I've had good teachers, but I was just wondering if that was anything that they used as experience into going into this exploration.
No, the big part of it, because it was you saw how quick the team was assembled, a lot of the deal had to go with they needed the right people for this particular cave, and the caves you mentioned, Dmanisi and Lingbao in Indonesia, are very different structural caves than this. So there wasn't a lot of similarity that way.
I'm going to ask the last question. John is part Neanderthal. Can you tell us why you know you're part Neanderthal?
My students would have a different answer to this, but... No, well, as many of you know, we have the advent in modern times here of what we call consumer genomics. And so you can go with any number of different companies, be it 23andMe, Ancestry. We have a new one that's based here in Texas out of Austin, in Cytome, which does it, and they have the opportunity to look at your how much Neanderthal you have in you. And basically, if you are of non-African recent origin, you probably have anywhere from 1 to 3, 4%. If you're more East Asian, you may have another group of what we think of as Eastern Neanderthals that have recently become very popular, the Denisovans, I can say that. So when I had mine done, it came up as 1.7% Neanderthal, which is not remarkable. Probably most of the folks, as I look around the room, probably fit into somewhere near that range. Now, the one fun thing that my students got to laugh at, they look at the variations on the on some of the genes, which are the Neanderthal versions versus modern human versions, and my boys found out that it was very interesting that their science teacher, of the 10 spots they look at, the one thing that I had that was my Neanderthal contribution was for learning. And I think that's a good way to end.